My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a software engineer at a tech company. I've always been close to my paternal grandfather, Harold Morrison, a 78-year-old man who built his life from scratch and has always been my greatest mentor. My mother, Linda Morrison, 56 years old, has always had a complicated relationship with my father and, by extension, with his family, especially with Grandpa Harold. My parents divorced when I was 15, and since then my mother developed a kind of resentment toward everything that represented the Morrison family. She always felt that my father and Grandpa Harold never treated her as part of the family, although I never saw evidence of this. In fact, Grandpa was always kind to her even after the divorce. Grandpa Harold lived alone in a 2-story Victorian house he had bought in the 1970s for $23,000. Over the years, especially with the neighborhood's development, the property appreciated significantly. The house was valued at approximately $740,000, something I discovered when I helped Grandpa update his homeowner's insurance last year. 6 months ago, Grandpa Harold suffered a mild stroke. Fortunately, there were no serious after effects, but doctors recommended he no longer live alone. After much discussion, he agreed to move to a specialized nursing home, but made it clear it would be temporary. He always told me it was just until he felt stronger, that he wouldn't sell the house because that house was his life. The nursing home where he settled was high quality, costing $4,500 per month. But Grandpa had his savings and his pension covered the costs. He was mentally lucid, physically recovering well, and always talked about returning home in a few months. During this period, I visited Grandpa twice a week. My mother visited occasionally, maybe once every 2 weeks, always complaining about how depressing it was to see him in that place. She frequently commented on how it would be more practical if he simply sold the house and used the money to ensure permanent care. Grandpa always got irritated with these comments. He would tell me that he repeated to her that that house represented 50 years of his life, that he wouldn't sell it while he was alive, and that when he died, I would decide what to do with it, as stated in his will. Yes, Grandpa had left the house to me in his will, not out of favoritism, but because I was the only grandson, and my uncles had moved to other states decades ago and rarely kept in touch. My mother knew this and had never directly contested it, but I could sense it bothered her deeply. The situation started getting strange 3 weeks ago. My mother began asking me specific questions about Grandpa's finances, about how long he planned to stay in the nursing home and if I thought he was really recovering. These were questions that seemed innocent, but there was something in her tone that made me uncomfortable. Last week, during one of my visits to Grandpa, he told me something that alarmed me. He said my mother had started visiting him more frequently, and that the previous week she had brought some papers for him to sign, claiming they were to update his health plan. He explained that he couldn't read properly because his glasses were at the repair shop, and she said it was urgent, so he signed trusting her. But now he was worried and asked me to check what those papers were about. I promised I would investigate. The following Monday, I called the family lawyer's office, Mr. Peterson, who had handled Grandpa's legal affairs for years. He informed me that no one had contacted him about changes to Grandpa's health plan. This left me extremely worried. On Tuesday, I decided to stop by Grandpa's house to check if everything was okay. I had a spare key, which he had given me when he moved to the nursing home, so I could check the property periodically. When I arrived at the house, what I saw made me feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. There was a for sale sign in the front yard. My blood ran cold. The sign was from Premium Properties Realty, a local real estate agency known for handling high-value properties. I entered the house with trembling hands and found clear evidence that someone had been there recently. Some furniture had been moved, drawers were open, and there were papers scattered on the kitchen table. Among the papers, I discovered documents that made me feel nauseous. There was a preliminary sales contract, a power of attorney document signed by Grandpa, and correspondence with the real estate agency. According to the documents, the house would be sold for $740,000 to a family willing to close quickly, without financing. The sale was scheduled to happen on Friday of that same week, in just 3 days. Most shocking was that the power of attorney document gave my mother total authority to make financial decisions on Grandpa's behalf, claiming he was mentally incapacitated due to stroke complications. This was an absolute lie. Grandpa was perfectly lucid, as anyone who talked to him for 5 minutes could confirm. I immediately called Mr. Peterson and said I needed to see him that same day, that it was an emergency involving my grandfather. An hour later, I was in his office showing all the documents I had found. Mr. Peterson analyzed everything carefully, his expression becoming increasingly serious. He explained that this was very serious. If my mother had obtained this power of attorney through false information about Grandpa's mental state, this constituted fraud. And if she was trying to sell the property without his actual knowledge or consent, the situation was even more serious. I asked what we could do, and he told me that first we needed to verify where and how this power of attorney was registered. Second, we needed to obtain a current medical evaluation of Grandpa's mental state. Third, we could file for an injunction to prevent the sale until the situation was clarified. We spent the rest of the afternoon working on this. Mr. Peterson discovered that the power of attorney had been registered at the registry office the previous week, coinciding exactly with the day my mother said she had visited Grandpa with health plan papers. Meanwhile, I called Grandpa's doctor at the nursing home. Dr. Williams confirmed that Grandpa was mentally competent and that there was no medical indication of mental incapacity in his records. In fact, he said Grandpa had shown consistent improvement and they expected he could return home independently within a few more weeks, with some safety adaptations. This information was exactly the opposite of what my mother had declared in the legal documents. On Wednesday morning, Mr. Peterson obtained a temporary court injunction preventing the sale of the property until the power of attorney issue was resolved. We also arranged for a forensic psychologist to evaluate Grandpa's mental state that same afternoon. But I knew I needed to confront my mother before things became even more legally complicated. I called her and asked to meet at Mr. Peterson's office on Thursday morning. When she asked what for, I said only that it was about Grandpa Harold, and that it was important. There was a long pause before she agreed. When my mother arrived at Mr. Peterson's office on Thursday at 10 a.m., she looked visibly nervous but was trying to maintain a facade of normality. She was dressed more formally than usual and carried a large briefcase. Mr. Peterson went straight to the point, saying we were there to discuss the power of attorney she had obtained from Harold Morrison and the attempted sale of his property. My mother's face went pale instantly, and she claimed not to know what we were talking about. I placed the documents I had found on the table in front of her. I said I had found everything at Grandpa's house: the for sale sign, the preliminary contract, the power of attorney, everything. She looked at the papers and then at me, her expression changing from feigned surprise to a defensive posture. She began justifying herself, saying that Grandpa needed full-time care, that he could no longer take care of that house, and that the money from the sale would ensure he had the best care for the rest of his life. I responded that Grandpa was recovering well, that the doctor said he could return home in a few weeks, and more importantly, that he had never agreed to sell the house. I accused her of lying about his mental state in the documents. She stood up abruptly and insisted she hadn't lied about anything, claiming that Grandpa was confused, that he forgot things, repeated himself, and couldn't even sign his own name properly. Mr. Peterson intervened, informing her that we had Grandpa's most recent medical evaluation, done the day before by a forensic psychologist, and that he had been considered completely mentally competent. There was no evidence of dementia or cognitive incapacity. My mother fell silent for a moment, and then her mask finally dropped. She exploded, saying she wanted us to know the truth, that man had always despised her. From the day she married my father, he had treated her as if she weren't good enough for the Morrison family. And when my father left her, Harold didn't even try to help her. Her words came out loaded with a bitterness I had never witnessed before. She continued, saying that now he was old, needed help, and who showed up was her. Who worried about his care was her. But when he died, who would get everything would be me, just because I was a Morrison. I said this didn't justify what she had done, that she had obtained legal documents under false pretenses, which constituted fraud. She laughed bitterly and responded that the real fraud was a 78-year-old man leaving a $750,000 property to someone who already had a stable career and good salary, while completely ignoring the woman who had cared for him when he needed it. Mr. Peterson explained that he understood she might feel wronged, but that the law was clear. Harold had the right to dispose of his property as he wished, as long as he was mentally competent, which he was, and obtaining power of attorney through false statements was a crime. I asked what she wanted from us, and she questioned what would happen if she didn't cooperate. Mr. Peterson responded calmly that we would file a criminal complaint for fraud and elder abuse, which would result in federal charges, since it involved a significant amount of money and exploitation of an elderly person. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, my mother sighed deeply and agreed to cancel the sale, but made sure to say this didn't solve the fundamental problem: that Harold Morrison had never seen her as family, and that now we were ensuring she continued to be treated like a stranger. I responded gently that Grandpa had always treated her with respect, and that the problem was she had created expectations that were never promised. His house was his to do with as he pleased. She looked at me with an expression that mixed sadness and anger, saying I didn't understand because I had never needed to fight for recognition, that I had always been the golden grandson, the automatic heir. She had spent 25 years being part of that family, and when all was said and done, she was treated as if she were invisible. Her words hit me in an unexpected way. I began to realize that behind her wrong actions there were years of accumulated pain and feelings of exclusion that I had ignored. I asked why she had never talked to me about this, why she had never tried to resolve it honestly. She responded, with tears beginning to form in her eyes, that she knew it wouldn't help, because the decision had already been made years ago. She just wanted to make sure her years caring for that family meant something. At that moment, I realized the situation was more complex than I had initially imagined. My mother had acted wrongly and illegally. That was indisputable. But her feelings of exclusion and devaluation were real, even though her response to those feelings had been inadequate. Mr. Peterson prepared the documents to cancel the power of attorney and stop the sale, and she agreed to sign everything that same day to avoid bigger legal problems. But I suggested we talk to Grandpa about the situation, not about the attempted sale, but about how she felt regarding the family. Maybe there were things that could be resolved. She looked at me with surprise, asking if I would really do that, and I said yes, because regardless of what had happened, she was still my mother and still part of that family. At the end of that afternoon, after all the legal documents were signed and the sale officially canceled, I went to visit Grandpa Harold. He was in the nursing home's living room reading a book about World War II history. I took a deep breath and decided to be completely honest with him. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything: the attempted sale, the fraudulent power of attorney, my mother's feelings of exclusion, and how we had resolved the situation legally. Grandpa listened to everything in silence, occasionally nodding his head. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said my mother had done something very wrong, that this couldn't be ignored or excused. But then he added that maybe he too had done wrong things over the years. Maybe he hadn't been as inclusive as he should have been. The divorce between my parents was difficult for everyone, and maybe he had let his feelings about my father affect how he treated my mother. This surprised me, because Grandpa rarely admitted personal flaws. He continued saying that when you reach his age, you realize that holding grudges and resentments is a waste of time. My mother had made a serious mistake, but maybe it was time for all of us to talk openly about the family's problems. I asked if he would like to talk to her, and he said yes, but with my presence and maybe with Mr. Peterson too. We needed to establish clear boundaries about what was acceptable, but also address the legitimate concerns she might have. The following week, we organized a meeting at the nursing home. Present were myself, my mother, Grandpa Harold, and Mr. Peterson as mediator. The atmosphere was tense at first, but Grandpa Harold surprised everyone with his approach. He began by making it clear to my mother that what she had done with the power of attorney and attempted sale was completely unacceptable. This had broken his trust and could have resulted in serious legal consequences for her. My mother lowered her head and admitted she knew this, that there was no excuse for what she had done. But then Grandpa said something no one expected. He explained that I had helped him understand that she felt excluded from the family, and that he wanted to address this too, because although her actions had been wrong, maybe some of her feelings had basis in reality. He adjusted himself in his chair and continued, saying that when her marriage to my father ended, he had sided with his son. This was natural for a father. But maybe he hadn't adequately considered her role as my mother, and as someone who had been part of the family for many years. My mother looked up, surprised, and thanked him for recognizing this. But Grandpa continued firmly, clarifying that this didn't change the fact that his house and belongings were his to dispose of as he wished. I would inherit the house because I was his grandson, and because he knew my character, but this didn't mean she had no value or wasn't respected. Mr. Peterson asked about the ideas Grandpa had mentioned for addressing my mother's concerns constructively. Grandpa turned to her and asked if it was true that she worried about his health care and well-being. She confirmed that yes, of course it was true. Then he made a surprising proposal. He said that when he returned home, he would need some modifications to make it safer: grab bars in the bathroom, handrails on the stairs, maybe a medical alert system. He would also need someone to check on his well-being a few times a week. He offered that she supervise these modifications and organize a schedule of regular check-ins. In return, he would establish a fund of $5,000 per year to compensate her for this work, and would also include a provision in his will guaranteeing she would receive $50,000 when he passed away, as recognition for her care. My mother fell silent, processing the proposal, and then asked if he would really do this. He confirmed, but established two absolute conditions. First, she would never again try to obtain legal control over his affairs without explicit knowledge and consent. Second, any disagreement or concern about care or decisions should be discussed openly with him and me, not resolved on her own. She immediately accepted these conditions, and Grandpa added that he promised to be more open about his decisions and more inclusive when considering family concerns. Everyone had made mistakes, and everyone could do better. 6 months later, the situation in our family had stabilized in a way I never would have imagined. Grandpa Harold had returned to his house, which now had all the necessary safety modifications, supervised by my mother. She visited him 3 times a week, not just to check if he was okay, but also to cook for him and help with household tasks. Surprisingly, they developed a closer relationship than they had ever had. They discovered common interests. Both liked history programs on the Discovery Channel. Both were crossword puzzle fans, and both had strong opinions about local politics. My mother never again mentioned the inheritance or tried to interfere with Grandpa's financial decisions. Instead, she seemed genuinely satisfied with her role as care supervisor and with the recognition she received for it. I learned several important lessons from this entire experience. First, that long-standing family problems can lead people to make desperate and harmful decisions if not addressed openly. Second, that sometimes people do wrong things for reasons that, while they don't justify their actions, deserve to be understood and, when possible, resolved. Most importantly, I learned that confronting difficult problems head-on, with honesty and willingness to find constructive solutions, can transform situations that seem irreparable into opportunities to strengthen family relationships. Grandpa Harold often tells me that almost losing his house was, ironically, what saved our family. Sometimes, he reflects, it takes a crisis to make people finally tell the truth to each other. The house remains his, as was always planned, but now it represents something more than just a property or an inheritance. It became a symbol of how our family learned to handle conflicts maturely and how we transformed a situation of betrayal and hurt into an opportunity for healing and growth. And I sleep better knowing that I protected not only my grandfather's assets, but also helped protect and restore the most important relationships in my life.